Well, the USS Canberra has arrived in Sydney ahead of the first ever commissioning of a US Navy ship in an allied country. It is an historic moment for the country's military alliance. Joining us for more on this is the Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Studies Centre, Peter Dean. Good to see you. Thank you for your time, as always. This is quite a moment, isn't it? Why is the ship being commissioned here in Australia?
Look, it's a really important and interesting moment. And USS Canberra, this is not the first USS Canberra. It's in fact the second US Navy warship to remain USS Canberra. The first was a Baltimore-class cruiser that was commissioned in 1943. And it was the first US warship to be named after a foreign capital city. And this happened because the US president at the time, President Roosevelt, named the ship in honour of the sacrifice of HMAS Canberra, which had been sunk in the Battle of Salvo Island off Guadalcanal during that really pivotal battle during the Second World War. So this is an extension of that. This is an extension of the relationship between Australia and the United States, sort of reflective of that enduring partnership between the two nations. And of course, we've seen a particular acceleration of the bilateral alliance relationship with the signing of the AUKUS agreement, and particularly on the Navy side of the fence, with Australia going to be acquired nuclear-powered submarines that's built off US technology. So this is an extension of that kind of historic event that goes back to the Second World War. It's a really important part of the recognition that during that conflict that the Australia and the United States served together to fight a common enemy in Japan, and the enduring relationship that goes on today. So it's really reflective of that in a historical sense, but modernising and keeping the alliance up to date by taking the next step of actually commissioning a US Navy warship overseas for the first time. So it's a pretty historic moment.
Peter, what sort of resources are on a ship like that?
Well, this is a littoral combat ship that is basically being launched, an Independence-class littoral combat ship. She was christened in 1921, and this is I have to say, a somewhat controversial type of warship within the US Navy's fleet. It was particularly designed to operate in these littoral regions, and it's been much debated over the quality of the build of some of these ships, but also the role that they will play, particularly as we're moving to more high-end conflict. They're a really unique design of ship as well. So they come in with a particular design of water jets and gas turbine and diesel engines. They've got a range of about 8,000 kilometres, although a crew of about 40 officers and enlisted personnel with a range of sensors and systems on board, as well as a 57mm gun and 11-cell missile launcher. And they're designed to basically do presence operations, to be involved in those closer seas, in the littoral seas in Southeast Asia and throughout the region, and basically represent the US Navy and be involved in lots of different types of activities. The question has come around a little bit about these craft, about their ongoing relevance in the concern of strategic competition with China. But what they do represent is the ability for the United States to really do high-end presence operations throughout the region, and then they'll take a range of maritime security operations.
Well, look at those pictures. It certainly looks like a very impressive ship. Anyway, those pictures in Sydney Harbour, pretty remarkable. Peter Dean, I did also want to ask you while we had you, we've been reporting today some comments from the Solomon Islands leader. He's back from a recent trip to Beijing, accusing Australia of unneighbourly behaviour, essentially seeming to accuse us of not providing the sort of funding that it wants in a variety of areas. It looks like that shortfall is going to be funded by China. Should we be worried about this? How important is this in terms of our strategic interests to have the Solomon Islands offside?
Well, as we know, the South Pacific is foremost at the minds of Australians in terms of our security and our relationships in the region. We are a part of the Pacific family. This is an important component piece of Australia's strategic engagement in that region as well. Now, if you remember back to the last election campaign, what was happening in the Solomon Islands became an electoral issue at that particular time. China has been increasingly trying to undertake strategic competition in the South Pacific and have further and further influence in this region. And what we're really hard to ascertain with the Solomon Islands Prime Minister is really what he says in his rhetoric and what he's saying in public, what the strategy is and what the actual substance of this relationship with China is. So a classic small state strategy in a period of strategic competition for a state like Solomon Islands often can be to play one side off against the other to get as maximum advantage that it can out of the relationship of both countries. But we've seen the Solomon Islands Prime Minister Secretary swing from one extreme to the other, depending upon who he's meeting with, depending upon who his last engagement with. And I would find it very surprising if we would see that China is actually providing this definitive injection of money into the Solomon Islands budget and economy in the way that the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands has said. There's been no indication from the Australian government of decreasing access funding or support to the Solomon Islands. And of course, what we know from the strategic documents that the government has released in the last period of time of 18 months or so since they've been in office is a further emphasis on engagement with the Pacific, both through the Department of Foreign Affairs and, of course, the Department of Defence as well. So this is one of those things where he's just come back from a trip to China. There are obviously some agreements signed while he's in China. And it sounds a little bit like there's a bit of a quid pro quo from the Chinese here about whatever support they're giving him requires him to basically make a particular public stance about that support vis-a-vis his relationship with Australia and other major powers in the region. So it's really hard to ascertain exactly. I think time will tell what the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands is really trying to do here. But I would be somewhat suspicious about what's going on in terms of the cost of his engagement with Beijing, and of course, the nefarious nature of Beijing attempting to push security cooperation onto the Solomon Islands. There's talk now from the Solomon Islands Prime Minister about setting up a defence force to supplement their police force. And of course, we know that the Chinese are about rule by law, not rule of law, and their way of doing security cooperation in many of these countries is an on-ramp to just much deeper influence within that. And of course, their long-standing approach to diplomacy with small states, we've seen this in Africa as well as parts of the Pacific as well, is about elite capture and focusing on capturing and ingratiating themselves with the political leadership and the business leadership, but not necessarily aligning themselves what's better overall for the country and for the broader populace. So this is yet another stage of strategic competition, which we're seeing in the region, which will be with us for, I'd say, a very long period of time to come.